bright, decent people. The Arbs were Bob Rubin, of Goldman Sachs, and Bunny Lasker, of Lasker, Stone and Stern. And they were honest, and if they thought they had inside information they'd call and ask. And if we said yes, then they'd freeze their position. And the clients were people like Larry Tisch going after CNA, or big companies going after other big companies, because they believed they could run them better. Now it's the Icons and the Jacobses and the Pickenses and the Peltzes and the Perelmans. And, this participant continued, displaying the paranoid-sounding mindset that the junk bond wars had induced, we have to have detectives in to make sure our rooms aren't bugged and our phone lines aren't tapped, and that they aren't sending electronic beams into our offices, and we have to look for hidden cameras when we go into and out of meetings. They have ruined my life. You feel like you're in the gutter, like they're piling shit on you and you have to keep struggling to get up from it. And it's all been made possible by Drexel. Without Drexel, none of it could have happened. While Revlon's defenders mourned, the Blue Team celebrated. When the deal closed in early November, Perelman hosted a dinner for 30 aides, lawyers and investment bankers at Le Club, an exclusive Manhattan night spot. Perelman's favorite champagne, Crystal, FL owed freely, and some of the key players put on a skit which, in the continuing color war motif, was referred to as the Songfest. It opened with the Phi RST Perelman-Bergerac encounter, in June, '85. Dennis Levine played Bergerac, dressed as a big game hunter, mimicking his French accent, calling Perelman an upstart and a Jew from Philadelphia. Engel played Perelman. Wearing Gucci loafers and one of his $3,000 Fiorentino custom-tailored suits, he fondled and puffed a fat Macanudo cigar and dropped its ashes on Bergerac's rugs. When Bergerac, Levine, offered Perelman, Engel, some Chateau Lafite, Perelman asked for vodka. Peasant, snorted Bergerac. There was plenty to celebrate for those on hand that night. Perelman had gotten the company of his dreams, though not for free, as he had originally planned. Its real cost would not become clear for some time, until the divestitures were completed. But for most of these merrymakers, particularly the lawyers and the investment bankers, the bust-up of Revlon had already spouted geysers of gold. Fees paid to lawyers and investment bankers in this deal came to over $100 million. Making it the most lucrative takeover yet. Even the $13.40 billion acquisition of Gulf Oil Corporation by Standard Oil, instigated by Pickens, threw off only $60 million in fees. Revlon's legal bill, from Wachtell, Lipton and Paul Weiss, is estimated at about $10 million, while Pantry Pride's from Skadden, Arps is estimated at $7-8 million. Fried, Frank, Harris and Shriver, representing Forstmann Little, was paid at least $1 million. But as is always the case, the investment banker's take makes the lawyers seem modest by comparison, though the bankers typically have far fewer people working on any deal than the lawyers do. Goldman Sachs & Company received about $3 million from Forstmann Little. Lazard Frères received about $11 million from Revlon. Morgan Stanley, once all the divestitures were done, received under $25 million, far less than the $30 million that had been established as their ceiling. In fact, Drexel had tried to persuade Perelman to ditch Morgan Stanley when they refused to put their name on the tender offer. And Drexel continued to argue that all Morgan Stanley deserved was its fee for having brought Perelman the idea. Not surprisingly, Drexel claimed the lion's share, over $65 million. In its July public offering of $750 million of Pantry Pride notes, Drexel received an underwriting discount, or fee, of about 3.5%, which equaled $25 million. It received another $11 million as an advisory fee. And then it received on its private placement of $770 million about $30 million. Moreover, when McAndrews and Forbes made its purchase of 37.6% of Pantry Pride stock for $60 million in the spring of '85, Drexel-related entities known as Prime Capital Associates had bought $10 million worth of that stock on the same terms as McAndrews. This stock was distributed, as such extras always are, to those whom Milken favored: himself, his people, some of the key individuals in corporate finance. Engel was one of those in Prime Capital Associates. Revlon's most senior executives lost their jobs, though they did not walk away empty-handed. Golden parachutes totaling $42.20 million were paid out to 13 executives. $15 million of this went to Bergerac's own parachute, the largest ever given. In addition, he received 5 years of salary and bonus, valued at about $7 million, and stock options and accelerated payment of restricted stock worth $13 million. In all, his severance package came to $35 million. Revlon's shareholders also did well. The stock was trading in the low 30s before the Pantry Pride rumors drove it up, and Pantry Pride paid $58 per share in the end. Immediately after the argument in Chancery Court but before Justice Walsh wrote his opinion, Pantry Pride had raised its bid from $56.25 to $58. Pantry Pride shareholders were not left out. That stock was trading at about 3 3/4 before Perelman took control of the company in the spring of 1985. Less than a year later it had tripled. And those who signed up for the bonds and bought them but wanted to trade out quickly also Professor I. Ted. One of the buyers said that over a period of several months, starting before Perelman announced his offer, but when the company was known to be in play, he had accumulated about $16 million of Revlon stock. When Drexel called to sell him the bonds, therefore, he had a powerful interest in seeing the deal go through. He sold his stock for about $18 million, he says, and then put that money up for the bonds at an interest rate of 13.75%, plus his commitment fee of 0.75%. The deal closed in mid-November, and within 2 weeks there were reports that Revlon was going to sell its Norcliffe Thayer Health Products and Rehees Special Chemical businesses to the Beecham Group of Britain for about $400 million, and its ethical drug division to Rohrer for over $600 million. Both deals were announced by the first week of December. Some onlookers were puzzled by the speed with which the Rohrer deal, particularly, was done, and by the absence of an auction. Howard Gittes, however, explained, they had an exclusive. Well, almost an exclusive. We said, if we get the company, and you commit to us now, then we won't shop the deal. This agreement should arguably have been disclosed in SEC filings if it was indeed made during the course of the deal. When later asked to comment, Gittes denied that anyone had been given an exclusive. At that point, in December, the money was just sitting there in the bank, but they couldn't buy back the bonds for 6 months, this buyer said. So it was completely safe now, good for the S&Ls, and Milken wanted the bonds back. That suited him, he added, because he wanted to get his money out. And he was eager to be a team player so that Milken would come back to him in the next deal. This is the same kind of movement of the bonds, out of the hands of a high-rolling buyer into those of the more reticent thrifts, insurance companies and pension funds, that took place in Triangle National Can. Here the high-risk, private buyers were freed to go on to the next megadeal, which in December was GAF Union Carbide, while the more risk-averse but still hungry players could be fed. The only dissonant note in this chorus of happy Professor I tears came, as is usual in these transactions, from the bondholders of the acquired company who found their paper suddenly downgraded now that the company was so debt-laden. Their prices, however, have since rebounded. This illustrated the gospel according to Milken, which proselytized that while low-grade bonds might be upgraded, high-grade could go only one way, down. Of course, when he FIRST started spreading that gospel, he had been speaking as an observer. Now, many years later, as Milken's raiders menaced companies which did defensive restructurings and then had their bonds downgraded, or acquired companies whose bonds were subsequently downgraded, he was often the propulsive force. According to Drexel, in 1985 $4.06 billion of junk bonds moved up into the investment grade category, while $9.10 billion of investment grade moved down into the netherworld of junk. 1 year after the Blue Team had had its high-spirited bash at Le Club, Perelman was still on the move. In October 1986 he had made a run at CPC International, the food processing company, and had then sold his stake to Solomon Brothers for a Professor IT of $41 million, in a trade which a Wall Street Journal, heard on the street, column suggested was pre-arranged, artificially infl aided, and, if so, Perelman's FIRST, albeit disguised, green mailing. By early November, Perelman had accumulated 15% of the stock of Transworld Corporation, a restaurant, hotels and food service conglomerate. Transworld then decided to liquidate, but Perelman got the option of buying its prize, Hilton International Company, for $1 billion. That option aside, in 1 month he had achieved on his $223 million Transworld investment a paper Professor IT of $55 million. On November 14, he offered $4.10 billion in cash, with Drexel's highly conference ident endorsement, for the Gillette Company, the razor blade manufacturer. Perelman was thriving as a predator. But whether the Revlon acquisition, which had raised him from an obscure, small-time entrepreneur to a corporate mogul, would in fact turn out to be the world-class company that he envisioned was less clear. He had purchased Revlon shares for about $1.80 billion, assumed debt of roughly $1 billion, and had expenses and carrying costs that brought his total acquisition cost to about $3 billion. He had sold several of the healthcare businesses for a total of roughly $1.40 billion. He had kept National Health Labs and Vision Care, whose value at the time of the acquisition, though it has since gone up, was probably about $1.20 billion. Therefore, Perelman had not acquired the cosmetics business for free, as he had initially planned, but for roughly $400 million. And Revlon's contract to sell the cosmetics business to Adler and Shakin, for a price that Perelman puts at $780 million, not $900 million, ended in litigation that cost Perelman $23.70 million to settle. By year-end 1987, Perelman would augment the cosmetics business, making it the world's largest, by buying Max Factor, Charles of the Ritz and Germain Monteil for more than $500 million. According to Revlon, operating Professor ITS for 1987 would double what they had been in 1985. Drapkin, who announced in October, '86 that he was leaving Skadden, Arps, where he had been earning well over $1 million a year, to join Perelman as a vice chairman of Revlon Group. Revlon was merged into Pantry Pride, which then changed its name to Revlon Group, Inc., predicted at that time that Ronnie is going to turn cosmetics around. I doubt very much that he'll ever sell Revlon. I think he sees it as the cornerstone of an empire. Others are less rhapsodic. It will be a tough struggle, very tough, says one established figure in the industry. Too much damage has been done. I don't know any cosmetics image that has ever been resurrected. Many questioned the wisdom of Perelman's having brought Saul Levine, a protégé of Charles Revson and former consultant, whom Bergerac had let go, back into the company as its president. Bergerac had let Levine go because he considered him wanting. Bergerac, as was to be expected, is foremost among the doomsayers. He is convinced that Perelman was seduced by the glamour of the beauty business, and that it will be his undoing. Cosmetics was worth $500 million at best, he declared. But instead of taking the $900 million for it from Adler and Shakin, he got good to average prices for selling the healthcare businesses, which were running like a clock, generating enormous professor ITS. So he got rid of the good and kept the bad. That would be at odds with what Perelman had managed to do in most of his earlier, smaller acquisitions. But the cosmetics business was in itself a break with Perelman's past targets. Drexel's Abecassis admitted, Revlon does have a phi-ckle aspect to it that Ronnie's other acquisitions didn't have. They didn't have to depend on sophisticated selling. In Revlon, you're selling dreams, so it's a different story. He's done some things at Revlon, cutting expenses, consolidating. But it's certainly not done yet, not by any means. And the measures he's taken aren't going to improve the business in the long run. Abecassis believes that Revlon could benefit from Perelman's full attention, but the peripatetic Perelman does not see it that way. His attitude is, he came in, he cleaned it up, he's ready to go on to the next, Abecassis added. It worked with FL Avors, McAndrews, it worked with Technicolor, but here it's different. I told him this, just the other day. He said, what am I supposed to do? Sit here and look at the business every day? Ronnie is a deal person, Abecassis concluded. He wants to do deals. Given that, it is not surprising that Perelman changed the plan he and Milken had agreed upon, that he would sell off the pieces of Revlon and pay down most, if not all, of the junk acquisition debt. Instead, Perelman refinanced those notes. According to one member of the UAC, Underwriting Assistance Committee, some of its members thought that Perelman should pay down the debt, but they were overruled by others. As for Milken's view on Perelman's keeping the cash, Abecassis said, Mike is a trader. He has the view, you go in and out. And he's a hungry guy. So he doesn't say, stop. Also, he trusts Ronnie. According to Abecassis, if the Transworld deal had gone through, Perelman would have had to give up, to Drexel, which would probably have distributed some to bond buyers, 30% of the equity. Ronnie doesn't want to give any equity, but if he doesn't, there's no deal. In Revlon, he gave Drexel warrants in Pantry Pride, and it was not that much equity. That was really a way of paying our fee. We fought. We told Ronnie next time he would have to give equity. By fall '86, Perelman was still dependent on Drexel for the multi-billion-dollar deals he craved. In Transworld, which would have been a $2.50 billion deal, Perelman had no other recourse, Abecassis insisted. You may not be able to sell assets, you need long-term money. And the banks won't do it. I went to a meeting yesterday. The bank, are nervous about $400 million, when we have $1.90 billion below them, subordinated to the bank's senior, secured debt. While it was not yet clear whether Perelman would succeed in resurrecting Revlon, its acquisition had certainly done wonders for his social climbing. Almost everyone who knows Perelman has a story to tell about his eagerness for that ascent, which dates back to his Philadelphia days, when he was rebuffed by that city's social elite, and for the company of the famous. He had on the payroll of Technicolor a consultant, named Dennis Stein, known for his brief engagement to Elizabeth Taylor, who, as one associate says, is a high-class golfer. Stein's apparent function, this associate says, was to introduce Perelman to celebrities, though with Taylor's departure it became less viable. A few months after taking over Revlon, Perelman hired a well-connected editor from Town and Country magazine, Nancy Gardiner, to be his social secretary. And he brought Ann Getty onto the Revlon board. Ronnie is determined to have a glitzy board, commented another of his associates. As reported by Spy magazine, Jacqueline Onassis, Halston, Caroline Herrera and Calvin Klein have been to the Perelman's East 63rd Street townhouse for parties. And Perelman would become the honorary chairman at one of the most socially acceptable and literati filled benefits of the year, for the New York Public Library. Referring to all the gossip about Perelman's eagerness to gain entrée to the rarefied social realm, Bergerac says, with an acid chuckle, Teddy Forstmann had the best line of all. This has got to be the highest price ever paid in the history of this country to get a good table at a New York restaurant. In September, '86, in the opulent Revlonoff ICES where he and the Drexels had arrived as hated interlopers and dropped ashes on Bergerac's Persian rugs, Perelman now seemed at home. He and Drapkin had liked calling attention to Bergerac's excesses, particularly the Boeing 727 Outef ITTED with a gun rack for his safaris, and the Revlonoff ICES in Paris which Perelman described as a castle. Now the company leased its corporate jet from a Perelman aircraft leasing company. And now that the castle was his Paris headquarters, Perelman had decided not to sell it, after all. He was having the New York off ICES redecorated. And James, Bergerac's butler, was now serving Perelman. Moreover, while Bergerac's $35 million parachute had elicited from Perelman and Drapkin a mutual outrage BEFITTING, two sign-bearers of the corporate revolution, the terms of Drapkin's employment would be far richer than any that Bergerac ever enjoyed. It is true that Perelman would take the company private in the spring of 1987, so Drapkin would not take his king's ransom out of public shareholders' money. But his employment agreement went into effect when Revlon Group was still a public company, and after taking the company private in the spring of '87, Perelman would owe public bondholders roughly $3.70 billion. The debt-to-equity ratio of McAndrews and Forbes, at the top of the Perelman pyramid, would be 18-1. In his 6-year employment agreement with McAndrews and Forbes Holdings, which comes just under Perelman in the corporate chart of the Perelman Empire, with all the other companies under it, Drapkin would receive $2 million as an inducement to enter into this employment agreement, which guaranteed him a salary that would escalate from $2,500,000 in 1987 to $4,192,650 by 1992. In addition, he would receive a bonus of $1 million each year. He would further be entitled to 20% of net trading professor ITS in investment partnerships that would be formed. A separate 5-year employment agreement with Revlon would guarantee Drapkin $1,150,000 each year. Thus Drapkin was to start his employment at Revlon, this paradigm of the new cost-cutting corporate age, with a guaranteed take by March 1988 of $6.70 million, which with Perelman-type trading professor ITS factored in could easily range into the tens of millions. Nor would Drapkin be the sole beneficiary of such Professor Legacy. Bruce Slavin and Howard Gittes would also be guaranteed many millions. When this reporter came to interview him, Perelman assumed his interview posture. He was wearing his uniform navy cardigan sweater. He sank low into his chair, removed his tasseled Gucci loafers, put his navy-stockinged feet up on the coffee table, and worked his cigar. The posture was casual but the man was not. He continually ground his molars. He seemed to be straining to project a pleasant image, but what kept appearing from underneath, pentimento-like, was a mix of impatience, vulgarity and boiling temper that was anything but pleasant. He raged at his secretary for taking 6 steps toward him to hand him a piece of paper after he had ordered her to summon Drapkin, something which required her to walk in the opposite direction. Associates say that he yells constantly at everyone who works with him: Jiddis, Slavin, Drapkin, Drexel investment bankers. No one except for Milken, they say, is exempt. One associate remarked, "It really is pretty bad. The excuse is he can't control it." When Drapkin arrived, Perelman addressed his erstwhile Revlon opponent's perception that by the end he was unstoppable, that if they had raised the bid to $59 he would have gone to $60. "There was no point where we were committed emotionally beyond financial reason," he declared. "Look at our record, in Richardson, for example. We have stopped where it made no sense to go forward." What about the fact that he had by that time raised $750 million, with high carrying charges? "It was reinvested," Perelman said shortly. "Right now I'm sitting on a cash hoard of $1.50 billion. I have a negative carry of about 1 point. I am willing to do that because tomorrow morning, without making a phone call, I could do 80% of the transactions that are available." Asked when he conceived of the megaleap he made with Revlon, Perelman replied that it was a process of bytes. No, he did not have this trajectory in mind when he started out in 1978 to buy the jewelry company, Cohen Haddif Ild. Go back to 1978. "Even if we'd net it, we couldn't have funded it," said Perelman, who refers to himself in the Rst person plural. This could not have been done without Drexel. As to the changes he has made thus far, Perelman said he had hired Richard Avedon to photograph high-fashion models for a new ad campaign and had cut through the excessive bureaucracy that plagued the company, eliminating numerous levels of review. All the bureaucracy, he added, stemmed from Bergerac. He did not run this company. "It's easier to shoot little birds than to run a company," interpolated Drapkin, referring to Bergerac's yearly shooting holidays in Scotland. "He put in layers of form rather than substance," Perelman went on. "Books this high, gesturing above his head, from each division. 4 times a year, he'd budget and rebudget. He brought that practice from ITT. Janine used that effectively. But Bergerac pulled out the form without the substance." Several times during the interview, Perelman denied that he had offered Bergerac extra inducements, either at the Rst meeting or later through Janine, the $100 million package, which was conference IRMED by one of Perelman's associates. Returning to this sore point, he put his shoes back on and paced the room, raising his voice. He demanded to know how Bergerac's charges, and his rebuttal, would be presented. "How can you believe what he says?" he demanded. "This guy was stuffing his pockets at every possible moment through the process. He had his finger in this pie from the very beginning. He was a guy totally motivated by greed. Do you think if I had said to him, 'Michel, what would it take?' he would have said, 'No, nothing'? Believe me, for $100 million, he would have taken it so fast your head would spin. He was stuffing his pockets at every opportunity. How can you believe this was not a guy who was stuffing his pockets? And what about that chateau bill in Scotland, prepaid for 2 years?" Perelman claims that before Bergerac left Revlon he wrote a company check to cover his shooting trips to Scotland. Perelman says he stopped payment on the check. And what about the 727 with the shower and the gun rack? Maybe you can say he didn't care about money because he was never spending his own. And what about when he took the china and silverware? He said he'd bought it, and then I came in here, Perelman argued, and they were rolling up the rug in his ICE and taking the wallpaper off the walls. Yes, the wallpaper. There was this $25,000 mural, African wildlife, and they were taking it off the wall. I said, wait a minute. If this stuff is his and he wants to take anything else out of here, I want to see invoices. That mural, Perelman said in disgust, was the ugliest thing I've ever seen. It's rolled up in the basement. He xed his visitor with a baleful look. Does that sound like a guy who is bashful about taking? The Revlon saga has no heroes. Bergerac, though far from being the inept villain that Perelman caricatures, indulged himself with the perks of corporate life. Perelman, cursed with his crude persona that offends so many, apparently attempted to entice Bergerac with lavish inducements and then furiously denied it. And Revlon's defenders, the cream of the legal and investment banking establishment, allowed their professional judgment to be clouded by their passion and their prejudice. On Milken's chessboard, however, all that mattered was that his pawns keep moving deeper into corporate America, decimating its ranks further, making bids and acquisitions and issuing junk bonds and doing streams of divestitures and making new acquisitions, until one day the game would be won. Part 3. The Zenith and the Fall 10. Drexel is like a god. BY November 1986, Milken was scouting new frontiers. "We want to finance the world with our goodies," proclaimed Drexel chairman Robert Linton. Indeed, Milken hoped to replicate in other parts of the world the hostile contest for control that his chosen had waged so successfully in this country. Japan, where the hostile takeover was still nascent, was his FI-RST target. On November 10, Drexel held a mini Predators ball in Tokyo. Milken presided over this lavish affair. It featured 2 days of presentations, with simultaneous translation, by a familiar cast, a dozen of Drexel's star junk issuers, including Revlon Group, Wix Companies, Occidental Petroleum Corporation, MCI Communications, Texas Air Corporation and Triangle Industries. The U.S. ambassador to Japan, Mike Mansef ILD, was a luncheon speaker. The event was organized by Harry Horowitz, Milken's Washington lobbyist and the chief organizer of the Beverly Hills Bond Conference in 1985. Even Don Engel, of Bungalow 8 fame, was on hand to play his accustomed part, ushering some of the Drexel clients to baths, Japanese massage parlors, outside Tokyo each night after dinner. Drexel executives deemed the conference a huge success. They believed that the Japanese, while still cautious, they traditionally were buyers of AAA credits with household names, were now ready to wade into the junk market. The Japanese seemed receptive to the gospel Milken preached. That the rating agencies were wrong and that they, the Japanese investors, should reap the benefit of those prevailing misconceptions, as so many thousands of their American counterparts had done over the past decade, by investing in the high-yield companies of the future. While Milken did not make it explicit to this audience, they were participating in the FI-RST phase of the process he had authored in the United States. First he would build a client base of buyers. Then he would raise capital for small-time entrepreneurs. And finally he would transform those entrepreneurs into mighty challengers, financing their raids on the giants of Japanese industry. The process would be replicated, but the time would be compressed. What had taken 7 or 8 years to evolve in the US would probably occur within 2. And even if the Japanese culture proved too inimical to the hostile takeover in Japan, Milken still wanted to tap the reservoir of Japanese capital to mount raids in this country that were far larger than any he had ever backed, 10 and 15 and $20 billion bids. It seemed only natural by the fall of 1986 that Milken should be expanding his scope to cover the world. The home territory, where he was using junk bonds to revolutionize and restructure the American corporate landscape, was in some sense already appropriated. While there were certainly many more battles to be fought, many more giant corporations to be won, Milken's gospel had gained such currency that it was no longer the heresy of an outcast but the liturgy of Wall Street. If everyone had decided to come to his FI-RST party, mustn't it be time to start another? Milken may have been restless, but many of his colleagues would have been content to pause and savor the moment. That Milken, and Drexel with him, could have scaled the heights they had made some of them lightheaded. Who would have imagined that such a rarefied atmosphere would ever be theirs to enjoy? The payout from Milken's singular idea had been so bountiful, in terms of money and power, and even a growing social acceptance, that the prevailing mood at Drexel in the fall of 1986 was close to euphoria. It was captured in a framed quote, in large, bold print, which Drexel investment banker Stephen Weinroth had displayed in his office. Referring to the junk bond market and takeovers, it read, "Drexel is like a god in that end of the business, and a god can do anything it wants. They are awesome. You hate to do business against them." The quote was from Michael Boylan, the president of McFadden Holdings, excerpted from an article in the June 1986 issue of Barron's. It had been sent to Weinroth and other colleagues by Arthur Bilger, of Drexel's Beverly Hills corporate finance department. Many of Drexel's wish lists drawn up in early Cava's go-by sessions, wish lists which had been wistful, grandiose, almost delusional at the time, had become reality. Among them was the goal articulated by Leon Black in 1979 when he recorded the corporate finance team's resolution to FIND and helped create the robber barons of the future. Now, in 1986, Black expounded happily on his fully realized goal. "What I like about Drexel is that our clients are the growth companies of this country, and the heads of these companies are often real principals. They are the modern version of robber barons," Black declared expansively. "These are the guys shaking up management. These are the guys who are building empires." He ticked off his favorites, his friend and client Carl Icahn, Henry Kravis of Kohlberg Kravis, with whom he had worked on that FIRM $6.20 billion buyout of the Beatrice companies, Samuel Heyman, the chairman of GAF, whose $6 billion bid for Union Carbide had been financed by Drexel, Rupert Murdoch, whose purchase of television stations from Metro Media had been financed by Drexel, and Ronald Perelman. "I look at them as the Rockefellers of 100 years ago," Black continued eagerly. "They're very, very bright. They keep you awake. They've got lots of guts." But Black reserved his most exuberant praise for the man who made all this possible. "I'm not much given to hero worship, but I have to tell you I never thought there would be a Michael Milken. He's someone who sees the big picture all the time, and also the small picture, down to the details. He knows so many industries in such depth. He knows the balance sheets of companies better than many of our clients do. And he is so aggressive. He has an absolutely voracious appetite. He wants 100% market share. To be creating empire builders, choosing them, molding them, sitting on their boards, owning pieces of their growing companies, was heady business, especially for investment bankers who, before 1985, had been the lesser knowns of Wall Street. Black was not alone in his breathlessness. One of his colleagues in corporate finance, G. Christian Anderson, who had lived through what he refers to as the baton death march on Wall Street in the early 70s, when he bounced from one failing firm to another, declared that he once had thought of getting his doctorate and teaching history. But now, in 1986, he said he felt he was making history. "We are the gentlemen who finance and create change," Anderson declared. When I read Alvin Toffler's Future Shock, and he described this vortex of change that whirls around us, and it happens very fast in New York City, and slower in Des Moines, and even slower in the outback of Australia, the thing that was amazing to me was, when I looked at the funnel of that maelstrom, the vortex of that sits right in the middle of my desk. I am the fella who determines what the change will be. If I don't finance it, it ain't gonna happen. I get to decide who's going to get capital, to make the future. Now, I ask you, what's more romantic than that? As overblown as Anderson's image of himself had become, there was a germ of truth in what he said. For the most highly leveraged mega acquisitions, the nouveau entrepreneurs who were changing the face of corporate America, Drexel was indeed the only conduit. What Drexel had done was to securitize the low-grade corporate loan, much as Salomon Brothers had securitized mortgages in its creation of the mortgage-backed security. In its securitizing of the corporate loan, Drexel had to some degree displaced the banks and the insurance companies, which had formerly had the acquisition financing rolled to themselves, just as their clients, America's major corporations, had had the acquisitor role to themselves. Now those banks' clients were as likely to be prey as predator. And those clients were being felled, one after another, in acquisitions more highly leveraged than the banks would ever have financed. The banks were lenders in many of Drexel's deals, but their loans were generally short-term and secured. Without Drexel to place the unsecured, subordinated debt, these deals would never have happened. And while other investment banking firms now were eager to play Drexel's part, the megadeals spawned securities, junk bonds, in amounts that no investment banking firm but Drexel could sell. Drexel's monopoly of this market, following the earlier years of monopoly of the non-takeover junk market, had resulted in a trajectory of growth that was unprecedented on Wall Street. At the end of 1977, Drexel's revenues were about $150 million. The firm had about $75 million in capital, of which less than $40 million was equity. The book value of its stock, as of August 1977, was $4.47 per share. By the end of 1985, the firm's revenues were $2.50 billion. It had about $1 billion of capital, of which over 75% was equity. The book value of its stock was $58.66 per share. Its professor ITS were thought to be about $600 million pre-tax and $304.20 million after taxes, which would place it not far behind the mammoth Salomon Brothers, which had nearly doubled Drexel's capital. And by the end of 1986, Drexel's revenues would soar to a record $4 billion and its after-tax earnings to an estimated $545.50 million, making it the most professor-I-table investment banking firm in America. Salomon was second in earnings, with $516 million. Goldman Sachs is a closely held partnership which, like Drexel, does not publicly report earnings, but its earnings were estimated by Perrin Long, an analyst at Lipper Analytical Services, Inc., to have been between $475 million and $500 million. The engine of this growth, of course, was Milken's Group. In 1978 it had been contributing 100% of the firm's professor ITS. With the growth of corporate finance, which Milken fueled, FIRST with the original issuance of junk bonds and then with the LBOs and the takeovers, the share of Milken's Group in the firm's professor ITS declined to roughly 43% by the end of 1985. But corporate finance, his adjunct, had been increasing its professor ITS at a rate of roughly 50% a year. In 1977 the corporate finance department had $4.20 million in revenues. In 1985, it had made about $700 million. In this entrepreneurial firm, where salaries were moderate and all the heavy compensation came in bonuses, those payouts were staggering. In 1985 Drexel is said to have devoted roughly $400 minus $500 million of its $2.50 billion in revenues to bonuses. Milken, Drexel's highest paid member, is said to have received about $40 million as his bonus. This did not include, of course, Professor ITS from all his trading partnerships and other investments, which associates estimated brought him closer to $100 million for the year. And even the top bankers in corporate finance, who had always felt like the poor cousins compared to Milken and his group, had little to complain about. Leon Black, for example, is said by one friend to have received about $8 million in a bonus payment that included warrants. And in 1986 Drexel would pay out as much as $600 million in bonuses, with Milken and his high-yield department reportedly receiving over $250 million and corporate finance receiving $140 million. One corporate finance executive, who estimated by the fall of 1986 that his bonus for that year would be roughly $9 million, commented, "This is Disneyland for adults." As spectacular as Drexel's Professor ITS were, they were no anomaly on Wall Street in the early and middle 80s. The M&A frenzy had thrown off enormous fees to the other major investment banking firms even before Drexel had a toehold in the business. Also, the period from 1981 to 1986 had seen one of the most powerful, sustained surges in stock and bond history. Firms were awash in trading Professor ITS. A number of Wall Street investment houses had taken advantage of this prosperity, too, to sell shares to the public and transform themselves from private partnerships into giant worldwide corporations. Salomon Brothers, which merged with the publicly owned Fibro Corporation in 1981, had increased its capital from only $200 million in 1980 to about $3 billion by mid-1986. But no other investment banking firm had vaulted into the financial stratosphere at Drexel's velocity. And no other firm had redefined the M&A business on its own unique terms, with the ability to raise billions of dollars almost overnight, from Milken's junk bond network, terms which could not be matched by anyone else on the street. Other firms sought to imitate Drexel. They attempted to break into the junk bond market. They embarked on merchant banking. They initiated bridge financing, at great risk to themselves, in a desperate attempt to compete with the highly conference-ident weapon. What had happened by the fall of 1986, quite simply, was that Milken had cast not only Drexel but to a large degree the street in his image. The most powerful firms, with the most cachet, had made their entrances into the heretofore disdained junk market in 1983 and 1984. By the end of 1985, Salomon, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and First Boston, in that order, were each making small incursions into Milken's preserve. Trailing close behind them came many other notable investment banks. Drexel's market share slipped to about 56% from the sovereign 60 to 70% it had held in earlier years. But even now, with its market share lowered, there was no close second, just a crowd of would-be competitors at the lower end of the chart. In 1985 Drexel had done 73 deals, for a total of $6.70 billion, and Salomon, its closest competitor, had done 9 deals for $1.40 billion. Some of Milken's colleagues at Drexel took undisguised pleasure in their rivals' flounderings. Morgan Stanley, for example, having FIRST suffered the Oxoco debacle, where the company had defaulted within 6 months of the underwriting, had embarrassed itself further in its underwriting of $540 million of People Express bonds, some of which had plunged to as little as 35% of their issue price by July 1986. As Chris Anderson commented to the Wall Street Journal, they, Morgan Stanley, announced with great fanfare that they were coming in to gentrify the high-yield market. Anderson was referring to a trade publication headline that had trumpeted Morgan's entrance. I wonder how they feel about it today. Maybe it's a tough business. Maybe it isn't any more genteel than the steel business or the auto business or the banking business. Milken struck a different note. He told this reporter in an interview in 1987, "I welcome competition. Other people might see things we don't see. We might see things they don't see. The negatives are, and I'm trying to state this in a positive way, that some deals may get done that shouldn't get done, and then that may hurt the perception of the high-yield market. People have a tendency to remember only the ones that didn't work out." Financing is an art form, Milken added. One of the challenges is how to correctly finance a company. In certain periods of time, more covenants need to be put into deals. You have to be sure the company has the right covenant, to allow it the freedom to grow, but also to ensure the integrity of the credit. Sometimes a company should issue convertible bonds instead of straight bonds. Sometimes it should issue preferred stock. Each company and each financing is different, and the process can't be imitative. By 1986, Milken's rivals had also followed in his footsteps by venturing into merchant banking, a term borrowed from the British, whose investment banks in the 19th century had pooled capital to buy businesses and thus had built empires. In this country it meant that the FIRMs were putting up their own capital in deals, mainly takeovers and buyouts. They were no longer acting solely as agent, but also as principal. This was something, of course, that Drexel, through Milken, as well as a few others, such as Allen and Company, had been doing for years. But Drexel's rivals had also come up with a new variation on merchant banking, the bridge loan. There, the investment bank puts up its own capital as a loan in order to facilitate a client's deal. That loan in effect bridges the time from the closing of the deal to the time when the junk bonds are sold. The proceeds of the sale then pay off the loan or, if the investment bank is leaving some of its capital in the deal, part of it. In their enthusiasm, Solomon and a group of institutional lenders who were participating in thus funding deals together dubbed themselves the Bridge Club. It was inevitable, once these FIRMs, tantalized by those 3 to 4% spreads, had followed Milken into the original issuance of junk bonds, that they would then attempt to follow him the next step, to the junk bond financed takeover and buyout. How could they not try, after watching Drexel garner a financing fee of $86 million in the Beatrice buyout? Milken had no patent on greed. Although he did, arguably, give the word new meaning. Drexel's financing fee in Beatrice was dwarfed by the amount Drexel partners were said to have earned by 1987 from their equity stakes in the deal. Close to $800 million, several hundred million of which was said to have gone to Milken personally. But none of these investment banks had Milken's ability to tap into his network and raise billions overnight. None of them could enlist his buyers to give them a bridge loan, which is in essence what these buyers did for Milken. His first-tier buyers, who committed to buy the bonds and earned the commitment fees, but were often replaced by second-tier buyers by the time the deal was funded, or shortly thereafter, provided him a bridge. Milken's rivals had two problems. First, they didn't have Milken's distribution system, and so they were unable to place $4-5 billion in junk. Second, they needed more time to place what they could. The bridge loan cured the time problem and made deals with less than $2 billion in junk financing viable for them. From the client's standpoint, the bridge went the highly conference ident letter one better. While that letter had been largely accepted in the business world as transmutable into cold cash, it was not cold cash. But now First Boston, Morgan Stanley, Shearson Lehman, Merrill Lynch, Solomon Brothers and others were offering to put cash into their clients' hands, and take the risk of the refinancing themselves. That risk was considerable, for time here was a two-edged sword. Crucial for them to be able to place the bonds, but dangerous in that the market could change. That, of course, had been the beauty of Milken's system. That there was such bountiful reward for so little risk to him or the firm. When Icahn suggested that Drexel in essence give him a bridge loan in Phillips, his proposal had been dismissed and the highly conference ident letter conceived instead. But in their desperation to reap Drexel-like rewards, other firms were seduced into greater risk than Drexel had ever taken. These firms' deepest obeisance to Drexel, however, came not when they tried to imitate and compete, but when they simply gave up and encouraged their clients to bring this much-hated rival into their deals, so that the dreadnought would be on their side. According to two executives at Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrette, which along with Drexel represented management in the buyout of Viacom, they had urged their clients to hire Drexel, for just that reason. And it was the same thinking, according to a well-placed source, that led Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, in planning a defensive restructuring after a month of frenzied trading in its stock during October 1986, to hire Drexel along with its traditional investment banking firm, Goldman Sachs. While the rest of Wall Street was trying occasionally to disarm but more often to compete with the renegade firm, Drexel was not only fighting to keep its lion's share, but also gearing for posterity. Fred Joseph had become the firm's chief executive off ICER in May 1985. And Joseph was intent on building a towering, enduring financial institution from the foundation that Milken's machine had laid. Over the past several years, Drexel had been plowing some of its enormous professor ITS into new areas. Dr. Richard Sandor, generally considered the principal architect of the interest rate futures markets, joined Drexel in 1982 to develop a financial futures division. Joseph's brother, Stephen Joseph, joined Drexel from Solomon Brothers in 1984 to start a mortgage-backed securities department. By 1986, his department had 280 employees and ranked in the top 5A of the industry. In municipal finance, where it also expanded enormously through lateral hiring, Drexel in '86 underwrote some $15 billion in offerings, up from $1 billion 2 years earlier. It went from being ranked as the 40th largest participant to number 11 or number 12. And in '86 Drexel also moved from 15th to 8th place in U.S. government securities trading. And Drexel, albeit far more measuredly than some of its compatriots, such as Solomon, followed the Wall Street trend toward globalization, expanding its off-ICES abroad, particularly London and Tokyo. Symbolic of this drive to make itself into a well-rounded Wall Street titan was Drexel's decision, in July 1986, to move from its scattered quarters at 55 and 60 Broad Street into the brand-new 2 million square foot, 47-story tower, 7 World Trade Center. Drexel, which acquired a minority interest in the skyscraper, committed to lease the entire building for $100 million a year. In 1986 the firm had 4,300 employees in New York, but the new tower, it was planned, would eventually house 10,000 employees. This institution building was Joseph's vision more than Milken's. It always had been. What motivated Milken was a consuming passion for dollars, and for an empire, ever widening, to control. But Joseph was bent on fulfilling the ambition he had expressed to Mark Kaplan, Drexel's then president, 6 months after arriving at the firm in 1974, when he said that, given 15 years, he could create something as important as Goldman Sachs. The iconoclastic Milken would have derided such an aspiration. Joseph, however, did not wish to remain the outsider forever. He would join the club. And now, 12 years after his declaration to Kaplan, he was on track. As Stephen Weinroth remarked, "Don't take me literally, but Fred, Joseph, would like to travel around the country and say, Drexel is the largest underwriter of corporate securities, and of this, and of that. He'd like to say, the largest in all things. And if he had to say that we were second largest in trading of government securities of Somaliland, he'd say, but we're gaining on the leader. And if we were the largest in everything, and we made only $10 million, he'd still be happy. He's a market share guy. A central tenet at Drexel, frequently articulated by both Milken and Joseph, was that it was not capital but people that were the scarce resource. Both of them, therefore, were willing to pay more than anybody on the street in order to hire and keep those they considered the best. In Milken's group, where the pay had been astronomical since the 70s, there were few defections. It was a historic event when, in the fall of 1986, one of Milken's traders of more recent vintage, Eugene Wong, was hired away by Prudential Batch. The headhunter had made a host of calls, seeking one of Milken's disciples. People did burn out, or worse, under Milken's ceaseless lash. One trader was rumored to have been found under his desk chewing his phone cord one day. But then they were generally shifted to less stressful positions off the trading desk, or placed outside Drexel to operate as adjuncts. A few simply retired, at an early age. Charles Causey, who had been with Milken since the Drexel Firestone days, gave it all up in 1981 and moved to Islamorada in the Florida Keys, to devote himself to Bone Fi Shing. In 1985 and 86, Joseph had gone on a Phi RM-wide hiring binge, as part of his goal of diversifying the Phi RM strength and expertise. By early 1986, one big drawing card he was playing as a recruiter was that Goldman Sachs was the only other highly Professor I-table private firm on the street. If Drexel ever went public, its shareholders and the stock was widely held throughout. The firm, with about 1,800 stockholders in all, would be likely to reap a bonanza. Now, in the fall of 1986, Joseph pointed with pride to some of his star recruits. Martin Siegel, whom he had finally succeeded in wooing from Kidder, Sam Hunter and Michael Jack Kugler from Merrill Lynch, Jeffrey Beck from Oppenheimer and Company, and Robert Pangia from Kidder. He had had some rejections, among them Bruce Wasserstein, the M&A star at First Boston, who would later leave to start his own firm, and Michael Zimmerman, a fast-rising M&A banker at Salomon Brothers who would soon become co-head of M&A there. But Joseph was still ardently recruiting. The day Drexel gets the last of the best people, for each position, is the day the bottle's over, he promised. And the buckets of money that Drexel was offering were not only for the superstars. Offers to the lower-tiered people also made the pay at other firms seem, as Martin Siegel had once commented, like the margarine spread. The case of one analyst at Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrette is typical. DLJ had hired him out of Harvard Business School at $80,000 a year. After he had been with them for 1 year, he was doing good though not exceptional work in the healthcare field, and his salary and bonuses had risen to about $110,000. Drexel, meanwhile, had hired a corporate finance team specializing in healthcare businesses from Kidder, but it lacked an analyst. So Drexel targeted the DLJ analyst. They offered him $350,000. According to a DLJ executive, the analyst had been happy at the firm, content with his salary, never even imagining that he could be making more than 3 times as much. But when that tripled offer came, it was too much to resist. It was clear by the fall of 1986, however, that in Drexel's sweep of the street, in its self-touting as the hottest firm, one with a daring-do, entrepreneurial culture where there was virtually no limit to the dollars that someone with talent and drive could make, it had attracted some so greedy that even Drexel was unable to sat their hunger. Dennis Levine was a warm, jovial investment banker whose personality outshone his intellectual attributes. Nonetheless, he had made himself into enough of an M&A presence that when he was passed over for a managing directorship at Shearson Lehman in 1984 and decided to leave, he received job offers from 3 other top investment banking firms. But it was Drexel, which guaranteed the 33-year-old an income of $1 million a year, that won the auction. On May 12, 1986, Levine was arrested, handcuffed and taken off to spend the night at the Metropolitan Correction Center. He was accused by the SEC of having made $12.60 million in illegal Professor ITS through insider trading in FTY4 stocks. And in June he pleaded guilty to 4 felony counts and agreed to cooperate with the government in its continuing investigation. Drexel reeled from the scandal. "It's more than embarrassing," Linton, the FIRM's chairman, told Businessweek. "It's like someone breaking into your home. You almost feel dirty about it." In private at the firm, it quickly became material for gallows humor. "Did you hear why Mike Phi read Dennis?" quipped one Drexel investment banker. "Because anybody who had to do Phi FTY4 trades to make $12 million couldn't be any good." Levine's case quickly mushroomed into the scandal of Wall Street as his cooperation with the government led to charges against members of his ring, investment bankers from Shearson Lehman, Lazard Frères and Goldman Sachs, and a lawyer from Wachtell, Lipton. Moreover, within the next several months there were 2 other indictments, unrelated to the Levine case, brought against Drexel employees. One was arbitrager Robert Salisbury, who was alleged to be a member of yet another insider trading ring. The other was senior vice president in the FIRM's expanding international finance department, Antonio Gebauer, who was charged with having misappropriated funds from client accounts while he was a banker at Morgan Guaranty Trust Company. Milken had hired Gebauer to work on his Third World Debt project, attempting to find some original approach to the crisis, which, if found, would probably rival the original issuance of junk bonds in its payout. Both these individuals ultimately pleaded guilty. Drexel officials pointed out that all 3, Levine, Salisbury and Gebauer, had been at Drexel for less than a year, and that their criminal conduct had started, and, in Gebauer's case, occurred wholly before they arrived at Drexel. Furthermore, Drexel was by no means alone in this spreading scandal. With Goldman Sachs, Lazard Frères, Morgan Guaranty, and Wachtell, Lipton, Drexel was arguably in better company than it had ever been. By the fall of '86, the shock of Levine, who had been by far the most high-profile of Drexel's miscreants, had faded at Drexel. Soon, Drexel officials hoped he would be forgotten, erased from public memory, as cleanly as he had been wiped from Drexel's annals. Copies of Drexel's glossy 1985 annual report had just been distributed in the firm when the news of Levine's arrest hit. They were quickly recalled. New copies were issued, and in place of Dennis Levine's smiling image Martin Siegel's appeared. Siegel moved from Kidder to Drexel in February 1986. In so doing, he was betting more on Joseph than on Milken. After about a half-dozen meetings with Joseph through the summer of 1985, he had gone out to the West Coast in October to meet Milken. Siegel had found Milken almost frightening. Like a speed junkie, he thought, incapable of sitting still, shooting off ideas, here and there, like a sparkler. Milken told him, "When you start to add up how much you have, I don't want you working for me. Then you're not hungry anymore." Siegel thought Milken wanted to be the richest man in the world. That kind of rawness was not something Siegel wished to see in himself. He felt more comfortable with Joseph, a bright, smooth-talking and attractive salesman, like himself, and with Joseph's projection of their building a world-class financial institution together. He and Joseph were both builders, Siegel decided. He had built Kidder's M&A department from nothing, and Joseph, powered by Milken's engine, might indeed create an institution comparable to a Morgan Stanley, a First Boston, a Goldman Sachs. Siegel thought it was a historic opportunity to be in the vanguard of such an enterprise. And he and Joseph agreed that his presence would accelerate that process. Siegel had a franchise in tender offer defense, a whole roster of blue-chip and loyal clients, who, he guessed, would follow him anywhere, even into Drexel's lion's den. He made sure, too, that his relationship with Martin Lipton, with whom he had worked on so many deals and who was also a kind of father figure to him, would remain intact. That relationship had been soldered in 1983 when together they had inaugurated the poison pill, Lipton's creation, defending Lennox, Inc., against an attempted takeover by Brown-Forman Distillers Corporation. Other investment bankers on whom Lipton had tried to foist his poison pill had been reluctant to use it. It was sure to be open to legal challenge, they argued, and if successful it might kill the golden goose, the takeover business. But Lipton had urged Siegel that they should implement it, that if they did they would own the defense market. And that is not far from what had happened. Lipton had proceeded to carve out his defense franchise, refusing to represent aggressors in hostile junk bond financed deals and, of course, becoming one of the fiercest, most outspoken critics of what he derisively called Drexel's hostile, junk bond, two-tiered, bust-up takeover. Now Lipton promised Siegel that despite Siegel's joining the Huns, he would continue to work with him, but only on defense. So Drexel got not only Martin Siegel, but the promise of a sometime alliance with the dean of the defense bar in M&A, and the erstwhile leader of the establishment onslaught against Drexel into the bargain. Lipton negotiated Siegel's employment contract with Drexel. That contract assured that at the same time that Siegel would be satisfying his image of himself as a builder, he would be getting richer. He had obtained from Drexel a guarantee of $3 million a year for 3 years. With possible further bonuses and his investments in Milken's trading partnerships, he was sure to make much more. Drexel had also promised to make him whole on the Professor IT he would have reaped on his Kidder stock. He was that FIRM's fourth largest shareholder. If Kidder went public or was sold within 2 years of his coming to Drexel. Kidder was bought by General Electric about 6 months after Siegel left. If Siegel needed further confirmation of the financial opportunism of his move, he got it when the results of the first 2 months of 1986 came in at Drexel. In each of those months, Drexel made more money than Kidder had in the entire preceding year. However leery of Milken, Siegel had been at their initial meeting. Once he joined Drexel, he too came under Milken's spell. He went out to Beverly Hills for 3-day periods, spending from 4 a.m. to 8 p.m. with the indefatigable Milken, and was awed by the fecundity of ideas that had first seemed to him wild and uncontrolled. At Kidder, he had had to generate the new ideas, and they had never come to him from the trading side. Now Milken was the generator. Siegel's primary mission, however, as conceptualized by him and Joseph, was to build a defense business at Drexel, with the kinds of blue-chip clients the firm had never had. If Drexel was to become a major financial institution, it could no longer be merely a haven for renegades. Siegel's goal was to have 20 FIVA or 30 clients on a tender defense retainer, much as the law firm of Skadden, Arps did. And he got off to a good start. In his first month at Drexel, he contacted about 20 of his old clients. He began to represent several, either on defense or on financing. One was Lear Siegler, the aerospace concern and manufacturer of auto parts, which needed help because its stock was being accumulated by the green-mailing Belzberg brothers. Siegel was, of course, well situated to mediate with the Belzbergs, They had been part of Milken's coterie ever since Mesa Gulf. And ultimately the Beltzbergs were bought out by Lear Siegler. According to Dan Dorfman in New York Magazine, the Beltzbergs made a professor IT of almost $7.50 million. But the potential conference LICTS that could arise in Drexel's attempting to go both ways were vividly illustrated at this time. Contemporaneous with Drexel's representing Lear Siegler against the dreaded Beltzbergs, it was also representing the Beltzbergs as they green-mailed Ashland Oil. Here the Beltzbergs reaped a professor IT of $15.40 million, according to Dorfman. If there was not an ethical dilemma, conference LICTS of interest are rarely recognized in the investment banking world. Such dual purpose might give pause to the sort of client Siegel was trying to bring aboard. Potential clients might wonder, as they disclosed their financials to their investment banker, where his loyalty, or that of his partners, really resided. Siegel decided that the best way for his Kidder clients to overcome their fear of Drexel would be for them to become acquainted with his partners, to meet Milken, to understand that true security lay in their being in the Drexel camp, not outside it. So he invited more than a dozen of them to the 1986 Predators Ball. In 1 year so much had changed that even the old name, Predators Ball, sounded faintly archaic. Among the 2,000 guests were many CEOs of major corporations. T. Boone Pickens, the raider who had started it all with Mesa Gulf, and had been a keynote speaker at Drexel conferences